welcome the folks here in the room. I see quite a few people out of town, so we're sitting in Norman, Oklahoma, at the University of Oklahoma, and we're very glad that you could zoom in and join us. I see some faces of people who I've known for quite a long time. I don't know how you found out about this evening, but I'm awfully glad you did. And I want to just welcome everybody. I'm Alan Levenson. I'm the director of the OU Schusterman Center for Judaic and Israel Studies. Thank you for joining us. You can expect, I think, a pretty wide-ranging discussion tonight on memory, nationalism, gender, race, and I'm not quite sure what else. Each panelist is going to speak for roughly 10 minutes, and then we'll let the panelists start the conversation among themselves, and then we'll open it up to audience questions. Hopefully, if the technology works out, that will include questions from people on Zoom. I certainly hope so. Before introducing our three panelists, for those of you who don't know all three, I want to say a quick word about Berlin. I'm guessing many of the people in this room have been there. Quick show of hands. Almost everybody, not everybody. And I know that on the Zoom screen, quite a few people as well, I am sure, have been there. It's one of the most exciting cities in Europe, that's for sure. Since Moses Mendelssohn, a German Jewish philosopher, arrived at the gates of Berlin in 1743, it's been a special site for German Jewish history. Germany became a nation state only in 1870. Berlin, previously the capital of the Prussian kingdom, became the capital of what became called the Second Reich, Lutheran and Hohenzollern. Mendelssohn himself didn't earn the rights of residence there until he was world famous. But by 1914, when World War I broke out, Berlin had become German Jewry's largest city. In the Weimar Republic, Berlin became a symbol of modernity and was often sharply criticized as such. Munich, not Berlin, was Hitler's first attempted coup site. The Reichstag fire, boycotts, and Kristallnacht notwithstanding, some Berlin Jews survived the war in hiding. The most successful public protest against the Nazis, carried out mainly by Christian women married to Jewish men, and which led to their eventual release, took place on Rosenstrasse. Berlin, for all of its dynamism, is also a city heavy with history. I want to briefly, and given their talents, the introductions, because that's the next hour, which I don't want. So I'm going to briefly introduce our three speakers, and I hope they'll understand them. We're going to abbreviate their very impressive bios. Professor Karlos Hill, and I want to thank Carlos for initiating the idea for this evening, is the Regents Professor of African and African American Studies here at the University of Oklahoma. He is a proud affiliate faculty within the OU History Department, the Schusterman Center for Judaic and Israel Studies. Dr. Hill is the author of 3 books, Beyond the Rope, The Impact of Lynching on Black Culture and Memory, The Murder of Emmett Till, A Graphic History, and the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, A Photographic History, for which Dr. Hill was kind enough to speak to the Schusterman Center last year to kick us off. His book on the Tulsa Race Massacre won the Lyndon McIntosh Award for Excellence. Dr. Hill also founded the Tulsa Race Massacre Oklahoma Teachers Institute and has been serving on the boards of the Clara Luber Legacy Committee, the Board of Scholars for Facing History and Ourselves. He writes a series for The Nation, a nationally prominent magazine, and is just busier than you can possibly imagine. My close colleague, Professor Carsten Schapkow, will speak second, is a specialist in German Jewish history, modern Jewish historiography, and Sephardic history. He's the author of the monographs The Freedom to Philosophize, Jewish Identity as Mirrored in the Reception of Baruch D. Spinoza in German Literature, Role Model and Counter Model, The Golden Age of Iberian Jewry and German Jewish Culture, which has appeared in both German and English, and many other works, including a series of co-edited volumes, Conversion in Spaces of Jewish History, Darchei Noam, The Jews of Arab Lands, the Jewish Studies and Israel Studies in the 21st Century, for which he invited several members of the faculty here and graduate students to contribute, and we're very grateful for that. Professor Schapkow is also a faculty member in the Department of History, an affiliate of the College of International Studies, the director of the Center of Study of Nationalism, and over the last few years, especially has been highly involved with the University of Potsdam. He taught there as a visiting distinguished professor in 2020-21 and is currently organizing a student-faculty exchange between the University of Oklahoma and the University of Potsdam, a near suburb of Berlin, as obviously listeners know. And finally, I want to introduce, since she may not be quite as well known to all of you, Dr. Hadas Cohen, who is our Israel Institute Teaching Fellow, and has been here with us for a couple of years and will be with us next year as well. Professor Cohen earned her degree in law from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and her PhD in political science from the New School of Social Research in New York City. Her provocative doctoral dissertation deals with Israeli treason trials and how class, gender, and ethnicity affected their outcomes. Dr. Cohen has lived in Berlin for a year on a Leibniz Day grant, where she was doing ethnographic research on the Israeli community in Berlin, and which has resulted in many, many publications, both solo authored and with Donnie Kranz, many of whom you will know as a leading German Jewish scholar. So thank you very much for allowing me to make these introductions, and I'm going to turn this over to Professor Hill.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you so much for that generous introduction. Thank my co-panelists for agreeing to be in dialogue and conversation with me. Thank you to the Schusterman Center for hosting this wonderful event. I'm Dr. Karlos Hill, and I want to just emphasize a few things that Alan said in my introduction. I'm definitely a proud affiliate faculty in the Schusterman Center, which happened recently, so very, very excited about being connected to it. But I also want to emphasize that I'm a Black Studies professor serving in a Judaic Studies, Israeli Studies Department, or Israel Studies Department. That may be odd to some certain people. And so my Berlin experience, to a certain degree, makes sense of that. I want to talk about that tonight. I want to be honest tonight. Alan started the conversation talking about Berlin as a character in this conversation, which it should be, because it is a dynamic city. I've traveled across Europe, for the last 10 years and never had been to Berlin until the summer of 2022. And the reason why I traveled to Berlin was I was invited by Widen the Circle. And Widen the Circle was an international organization, but that's based in the United States, actually based in Boston, but it does all of its work in Germany. And the work that it does in Germany is that it honors, it recognizes mostly Germans, but also German Jews who are doing the hard work of Jewish cultural recovery in Germany, the destruction to Jewish cultural artifacts, sacred sites, that is being recovered in Germany as we speak. I was able to meet many of those people doing that really hard work because of Widen the Circle, the organization that honors and recognizes those individuals, particularly Germans, but also German Jews doing Jewish cultural recovery work, but also Holocaust remembrance. I want to share with you a video that will sort of deepen this explanation of the work that Widen the Circle does, because I want you to understand why I've become so passionate about its mission and in a certain way, an unofficial ambassador for the organization because of what they bear witness to and what they allowed me to, or gave me the opportunity to bear witness to when I was in Berlin. And so I just want to share about a 3.5-minute video with you to give you more context as to why I was in Berlin and the important work that Widen the Circle does.
Widen the Circle started with this award ceremony that my father started in Berlin that's been going on for 20 years that honors Germans who have done profound work to preserve pieces of Jewish history and culture in Germany. Many of these same awardees have done very, very profound things to fight prejudice or to reconcile with a history that allowed prejudice to grow or to make connections in the world that you would just not expect. Our awardees are amazing, and if you hear their stories, you cannot help but have some hope. I think about the Yellow Brick Wall project at an elementary school in Berlin. It teaches children about the Holocaust and the importance of preventing hate. The project is so inspiring that it influenced the construction of a memorial to the victims of lynching in Montgomery, Alabama. Or there's a man from southern Germany who spent 40 years in his hometown researching the history of the local Jewish community. Each year, through his efforts, dozens of Jews from around the world come to town to locate their family roots. In addition to seeing where their relatives lived and worked, they get an acknowledgement of how their relatives suffered that is very powerful. Or a teacher whose students are mostly from difficult immigrant backgrounds. She found that empathy for their suffering is the first step in helping them understand the suffering of others. They maintain a Holocaust memorial at a train tracks near their school, a place where thousands of Jews were sent to death camps. But instead of thinking of it as just an award ceremony, you can think of it in a different way, which is it's kind of a platform. This shouldn't just be about an award, it should be about impact. And that's what became Widen the Circle. So we thought, okay, if we're gonna have an impact, we have all these awardees, they have all this knowledge, maybe we should try and start a network. And that was the beginning of what became the forum, that we building a network that we never had before, both in terms of network of people doing the work, but also a network of what I'll call like visiting experts who are really good at what they do and feel moved by what we're doing. We've started this in Germany because that's where our foundation is, that's where our history is. But we can see how the same activities can be valuable elsewhere. And so now we're beginning both think and do things in the United States where we can experiment and begin to understand what's going to work there. And we know that these issues are relevant in both places. There's a tide of hate out there, and what we know is we have a way of having an impact on it, which is by identifying people who on the ground level are doing effective things to push back against this tide. And we bring ingredients. We bring our own expertise, we bring our network, we bring the ability to recognize people and to tell their stories and to inspire in order to push back against this tide of hate, to expand what they can do, but also extend it so that other people can do it elsewhere in the world. Widen the Circle finds and recognizes extraordinary work happening in unexpected places, primarily that relates to issues of prejudice and a shared understanding of the past. We are doing this because it's desperately needed. We're doing this because we have a 2-decade history of involvement in these issues. We're doing this because we've developed the capabilities and network and team to have a broad impact. And it's time for us to step up this kind of challenge. Our goal is to widen the circle of respect, understanding, and reconciliation.
So I want to talk about what, just briefly, Joel Overmeyer, the founder of Widen the Circle, was talking about in the video. Widen the Circle of respect and reconciliation is really about building a network of care and concern about Holocaust remembrance work, not just in Germany, but outside Germany, that extends into Europe, into the United States, Africa. Everywhere there's people doing remembrance work, they should care about that work and be willing to support. And the same thing goes for those people doing Holocaust remembrance work, supporting work that's happening in Tulsa and elsewhere, because these are very similar histories, or they're certainly akin to each other. And that's what I came to appreciate in spending about 10 days with people who were doing this work, hardcore work of recovery, similar to what's happened in Tulsa, but happening in Berlin and all parts of Germany. I just want to share one example of how I was touched and profoundly changed by the people that I met there. So part of the reason why I went was to do a presentation on what I had learned as a historian, but also a community member serving on the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre Centennial Commission, both trying to reconcile with the past, but also get justice for victims, survivors, and descendants. And so my hope was to share with them stories, to share with them insights that I had learned from about 5 years of working on that commission, and the hope that something of what I said could maybe contribute to support some of the on-the-ground work that was happening. And so one example of that work is happening at track 69. And I had the just wonderful opportunity to meet the high school history teacher. And I'm very into high school history teachers because I'm studying about Clara Luther, I'm writing about Clara Luther. So it only makes sense that when I'm in Berlin and I am, traveling across the city, mostly in East Berlin, but then also across the country, that it's a high school history teacher and her students that most captured my attention and my heart and my sort of sense of need to act. And so Zabet Schmidt-Hall, sorry for those of you on Zoom, but she's here, the very tiny German woman here. She has for years taken students, mostly from immigrant backgrounds, Turkish backgrounds, Arab backgrounds, all across Europe doing Holocaust remembrance work. But near to their school in East Berlin is a deportation site, a notorious deportation site where thousands of Jews were deported to death camps, work camps across Europe. And so these students that you see pictured here, or some of the students that formed a working group to create, but also now maintain this really, really sacred site. I was able to travel with Zabet and her students, as well as all these members here, other than the students who are a part of the Widen the Circle, and then a few of us are scholars who are participating as consultants. The point that I want to make is, I was so moved by how these students who were high school students, 10th and 11th grade, had found the courage, the empathy, the vulnerability to study history and to bear witness to a history that was not their own. One of the most powerful things that they said to me is that they learned more about themselves through studying others and the trials and tribulations of it. They learn more about themselves through studying the trials and tribulations of others. And so that was the level of conversations that I was having with these students doing really, really important remembrance work that's drawing not just national attention in Germany, because Zabet Schmidt-Hall is a 2020 winner of the Obermeyer Award for not just what they did, but the impact that it's had on other work that's happened in Germany since then. Zabet has been written up in the Washington Post, the work that she's done, as well as her students who created a working group. So it's an alumni group that continues to support the current students maintaining this site. These students so moved me that I told them, and I don't tell people this all the time, but I told them, when you change my life, I'm going to change your life. That's how profound of an impact they had on me. And so because of that, one of their dreams is to come to the United States. And many of them, since they come from immigrant backgrounds, don't believe that's ever possible. And so I said, I work at the greatest university in America, the University of Oklahoma. We can find a way for you to visit the United States because you want to come here and study college, why not come to the best university in the United States, University of Oklahoma? And they love that idea. So we're working on a way to make that happen. But when they come here, they're not just coming to see, they're coming to learn about the remembrance culture that is Oklahoma, the Oklahoma race, or excuse me, the Tulsa Race Massacre, the 1950 Oklahoma sit-ins, the all-Black towns, the Oklahoma bombing memorial. There's a lot to talk about and remember. And so these are true remembrance workers who are really trying to glean as much as possible. And so I want to help them bear witness to the history of the United States as they help me to understand the history of the Holocaust. And so I can say more about that. I've talked too much already, but thank you for your rapt attention.
Okay, so I prepared some remarks, so it's a little bit more scholarly, so I apologize for that in advance, because I only have 10 minutes. So one of the questions was, what strikes you most about Berlin's commitment to remembering and memorizing the Holocaust? So first of all, we all have to understand that, knowledge of Jewish history in Germany is pretty much limited. So what people know is maybe some knowledge about the Holocaust, but it's also not really clear what people really know. So that is something we all have to be aware of. So we cannot expect too much. And remembering and memorizing the Holocaust began as and arguably still as a project of the political elites in Germany. So there was the slogan when the Federal Republic of Germany was founded, never again. And since then that is repeated, and repeated. And there are other ways to actually, what we just learned, to think about the Holocaust and the projects Karlos just told us about, and also the Stolpersteine, what we also saw in this little video at the beginning, which is a way maybe to connect people on a more general level with events of the Holocaust. They can relate to a family that once lived in their house, and then they see what happened to them when they were deported, where they died, where they were killed. So this is all, I think, important to create some kind of momentum to keep people connected with what happened. I also would like to bring to your attention the most recent report by the think tank Bertelsmann Foundation on the topic of Germany and Israel today, found out that the younger generation of under 30-year-old in Germany, and I would also add in the US based on my experience here, because I teach history of the Holocaust and Jewish history since I came in 2005, is very high. So the interest is very high, but the main difference is, if I may say that, in Germany, it's much more emotional. So when you teach the Holocaust there, students in your age are really angry what happened. They're upset and angry that there are a right-wing party again around in Germany, what is happening on a daily basis. They are really angry. And of course, because they also have this hidden space in their own family history that was hardly addressed. The question could be, well, why do we always need to find survivors of the Holocaust who were Jewish? What about the millions of Germans who were actively involved for that? This is this blank spot that is still there. And so I see much more direct reactions when I'm in the classroom there in comparison to what I see here. So here it's this curiosity, and sometimes family history is somehow related, but much more in distance. So that's the main difference. So Alan asked me, can you explain the Stolperstein, the stumbling stone? So I have an image here on the screen. Tries told me to just close this here. I'll never look at this. So, okay. Close. Okay, so no, it doesn't matter. So the artist Günter Demling remembers the victims of National Socialism by installing commemorative brass plaques in the pavement in front of their last address of choice. Now throughout Europe, it costs 120 euros, and we don't have it any longer only in Germany, but also in other places surrounding Europe. And he's basically citing the Talmud that says, a person is only forgotten when his or her name is forgotten. So the Stolper in front of the building brings back to memory people who have once lived here. almost every stone begins with "Hier lived," and then the name. So here you can see it on the left. Here lived Babette Meyer, née Kahn, born 1857, deported July 7th, 1942 to Theresienstadt, murdered 2nd of December 1942. In the middle, he lived at Hanau, née Meyer, born 1885, humiliated, escaped into her death June the 2nd, 1942, and then on the other side, here lived Adolf Hanau, born 1878, protected custody, 1938. This is this quote-unquote term the Nazis used to bring people in protected custody. It was basically in prison, and from there they were deported to other places. And you see here how his life ended also in Auschwitz. So this is just in front of one house. And that is a way for people somehow to relate to that. And that is not any longer now a phenomenon, happening in Germany, but throughout Europe. So that is the one example. So can we learn anything from Jewish history and the history of the Holocaust? If so, what is that? And so Carlos already made it clear in his presentation. 20% at least of all Germans today have a migration background, and the Germans like to play around that word a lot, and it's not positive. Unlike in Germany, it's not positive if someone asks you in Germany about your migration background, because it means something bad. It's not positive, like here where everyone has something positive to say of whoever they are. It's not the same in Germany. So the question for us is, or for you, for me, for all of us, how do other people think about the Holocaust who are not ethnic Germans? And that's what you just presented in the talk, Carlos. It was very enlightening to me. Apparently, yes, it's very important to reach out to other people, because when you only tell the other people who are non-ethnic Germans, you have to remember the Holocaust. Why should they? They can only remember if they relate somehow to it. That's most important. And the book we all read over the summer at some point, that is Susan Nyman's Learning from the Germans, Race and Memory of Evil. And she's just giving that one example, that there's this Druzy Israeli who's basically saying, to send someone who is not born in Germany once in his lifetime to a concentration or death camp will not help him understand what really happened. We have to do much more, and then people have to relate to their story, because everyone has a story of victimization, and that's where you can get it, and that, I think, that can only survive if the minorities, quote unquote, will be on board for a long time, because ethnic Germans sometimes have a more troubling perspective on that, as I just tried to say at the beginning. So how can memorization be an active spur for present day activism? I think memorization, commemoration, I'm sorry, I'm really tired, only cannot do that. But we also have to understand, and I see my friend Martin Schmielski there also on the screen, hello Martin, that we have to understand when people today think about Jewish life in Germany, and maybe with good intention, they think about the Holocaust, that it should never happen again, but they have very little understanding, and maybe I'm too negative about, that there is actually a vibrant Jewish community and a diverse Jewish community. Just one keyword, Father Jews. That there are Jews who consider themselves being Jewish, although following the halakha, Jewish law, they are not Jewish, but they see themselves as Jewish. And there are major Jewish organizations who see that differently. So there are much more diversified groups who feel embraced in that whole idea of being Jewish. So there are many festivals in Berlin, mainly on Muslim Jewish culture, Muslim Jewish conference in 2016, days of Jewish Muslim literature, and so on and so forth. So the main point is here that members of these Jewish and Muslim communities try to convey the idea. It's not the majority culture that tells us how to mourn or remember. We have really a lot of energy and ideas how to do that for the future. That's maybe the most important thing. Many people, I think, still simply don't get in general. That's really the main point. And also, there are things like, you might smile about it or not, agencies like quote unquote rent a Jew, introduced by Jews themselves. You can rent a Jewish person, and the Jewish person is coming to your class and talking about what does it mean to be Jewish in Germany. So that's pretty popular. Sounds a little bit odd, but that's a way that people can really get in touch. You can really get in touch with people who are Jewish, because most Germans never met a Jew, they have no clue. The only thing they know is about the Holocaust, and that doesn't help them necessarily to get to start. That's an organization, a Jewish organization who's doing that.
Specify secular, Orthodox. Do you get it? What kind of?
I don't think so. I can't look into it. But the point is here, I mean, it sounds maybe in American context bizarre, but Germany is not, of course, not New York and not Israel. It's really different. And most people have these really big issues when talking about Jews. Even how the word Jew is pronounced in German by people, it's really weird that there is this word. Yeah, just put it that way. It's just different. For me, it's still different when I said Jew in American English or Jew in Deutsch. It's really different. Okay, so that's more the personal contact with that. Also, with all the positive things we should keep in mind and keep on going, also keep in mind in 2021, according to the Department for Research and Information on Anti-Semitism in Berlin, there were 2,700 incidents in the country, including 63 attacks and 6 cases of extreme violence against Jews. And just 2 days ago, the rabbi of the country, or the state of Brandenburg, was attacked in public. So every day I get many of these news on my screen. So that's also the reality. You know, that, I mean, we cannot talk it away. Anti-Semitism is in the rise, and it's very, very visible in Germany. If you want to see it, you know, don't want to see it, you don't see it. Okay. So I talked a lot about difference in terms of teaching, and I think that's pretty much my my little overview following these questions. I think maybe it makes sense to some extent before the questions. So thank you for it. Thank you.
Hi, so thank you for the kind invitation to speak about this fascinating topic, and thank you everyone for being here, both here and online. And it's interesting how each and every one of us seems to be talking about this topic from a different perspective, even though we exchange emails and we try to come up with a certain point of view on it. But yeah, so I'm going also to talk about from a little bit of a different perspective, from my own experience as a Jewish Israeli who went to Berlin to do a one-year postdoc. But before I'll talk about that, I want to kind of introduce, tell you a little bit about myself to understand how I came to do this. So I am the granddaughter of survivors. On my mom's side, it was so bad that they never spoke about it, and they refused their reparations. Like, families were completely annihilated, so there was silence there. And my dad's side, they belonged to the category of almost. They were almost killed. They were almost sent to the camps. But they lived in Jerba, Tunisian island above Tunisia in the Mediterranean, northern part. And when they basically could buy their lives by giving gold to Rommel, who passed through Tunisia, and basically that's how they had their lives saved. My dad was 4 at the time, doesn't remember anything of it, and has no recollection, and they received reparations. So funny how these things work, right? So here there's also no way of talking what happens, but the silences, at least on my mom's side, definitely exist. So I came to Berlin to do a postdoc of 1 year, 2015, after a PhD, as Alan said, that I wrote about treason in Israel and Palestine, very emotional, very close to home, very scary, with meeting with different actors in the area. I was always afraid that when I would fly to Israel or back, the security services would take my computer because of the people that I met with. Everything is online, everything that I always say that, got clearance to do, but it was just too much. And I thought, oh, for my postdoc, let me write about the other side, treason, which is the concept of home, because traitors betray the sense, traitors betray the sense of home. So I thought, where would be an interesting place that a community builds a home for itself? And I thought, oh, Berlin, young Jewish Israelis are moving to Berlin. What an interesting place to go to, and what an interesting topic to study. So I thought, let's explore that. Why do they do that? These were my initial naive questions. What motivates them? And how does it make sense that they portray Berlin as a place of escape from the Israeli rat race? And in Israel, life is very structured. Finish high school, go to the army, maybe you go backpacking somewhere around the world for half a year or a year, get a degree, and then go get married, have kids, and so on, get mortgage. So they found an escape. So I thought, oh, but is that a place for peace? What's going on? So when I came to Berlin, I realized that these questions were totally the wrong questions to ask, and that each one of the more or less 15,000 Israelis that live there, very hard to count them for different reasons, were mostly Ashkenazi, meaning from European descent, highly qualified, have bachelor's degree, most of them. Many are self-employed, the artists and students, each have their own reasons. But not only that, the reasons change, and the way that they narrate their motivations for moving to Berlin changed through time. So yeah, and so I realized as I hung out with them, as I was doing ethnographic research in the city, in that community, I thought what's much more interesting is what is happening in the city and what kind of a life worlds they're creating for themselves. So if you allow me, let me go back for a second to reconciliation and moving on from traumatic experiences and so on. So according to different theories in psychology and social psychology, when man-made or a human-made disaster happens, in which there are very clear recognition of who is the victim and who are the aggressors. What could really help and contribute to the healing is if the oppressors will recognize what they have done, will apologize publicly in a humiliating manner. In a humbling manner. Some theory says it has to be humiliating in order to basically avenge for the honor, but humbling is good enough. And we, as the victims, want to hear an official request for forgiveness. We want to see that real change took place within the souls of the aggressors. And for the Israeli case of those young Israelis, and Germany has done that, by the way. I see with all of the criticism, the political elites, it doesn't matter who's spearheading in Israel, the way it's experienced is that this process has indeed happened. But the case of young Israelis moving to Berlin is a little bit more complicated, right? Because we're talking here about the grandchildren of the aggressors, and the grandchildren of the victims. And it's very, again, how does one apologize for something that they didn't do, that is the Germans? And for the young Israelis, I mean, what would they even do with this kind of an apology? I mean, they're already there, want to start their new lives there. We can't use regular reconciliation theory. And I think that, so what is happening on the ground could perhaps be best explained through a description of a show that I went one day to see called The White Shadow, in which an Israeli actor, the grandchild of a man, survivor, his grandmother survived Auschwitz, and a German actress, woman, that her grandfather was one of Hitler's guards, danced around, and Hitler guards in the bunker in his last days. So again, let's make this even more dramatic, right? They danced around a circle of soil and they talked about their experiences. Afterwards, I met both of them and interviewed them, and she told me that her whole family works as social workers or somehow related to taking care of people. She had a lot of PTSD symptoms until she worked on that show. So you can see how it stayed with her. And what they said that they were doing was basically working, they were trying to deal with their collective shadow through a rebirth and inventing a new shadow, a new language to deal with the past. So I think that's really interesting how we see that the grandchildren and even the great grandchildren of those survivors and of the aggressors are trying to deal with their trauma together. So what I saw that was happening there was basically two kinds of vectors. One was that had to do with the past. So these young Israelis were exploring their own identity. And the way that they were doing that is that they were tapping into Berlin's Jewish life in the 1920s, pre-Holocaust, by translation projects of Jewish and German prose, by doing art exhibitions and panels like ours with German colleagues of their age in areas that were once Jewish neighborhoods. So that was one thing that was going to the past. But I thought that the more interesting thing that would happen, another interesting thing, was the creation of a new political community in a way. And again, I'm limiting this, it's very small, it's not representative, and so on. But well, in the back report, I think still one can say something through it. That they realized that when they came to Europe, these Ashkenazi European descent Israelis, they realized that they were not seen as European by their German friends and colleagues. No, they were seen as from the Middle East. And what happened is that they started doing mutual projects or linking with other refugees from the Middle East. And I would like to end with a quote from an essay that one of my female interviewees basically wrote, about this experience. And she was a 40-year-old woman, a writer and a yoga teacher and a shiatsu healer. And when I met her, she said, oh, there was something interesting having to do with what we're offer. I had enough communion, which I just thought about it. Wow, in Israel, who has time to do that? Anyway, so it was published in Israel and a local newspaper in Jerusalem. So she starts with the Holocaust and then she moves on to the Middle East. So allow me to quote her. I arrived here from Jerusalem, she said, where I grew up in a Jewish home. What made the house Jewish was the never-ending religious or traditions. It was always the Holocaust. I grew up as a legacy of persecution, on the legacy, persecution, and this is what made me Jewish. And now to the Middle East, she's describing this kind of trajectory I spoke about. I'm sitting and writing in Cafe Kuti, located in the first floor of a large concrete building overlooking the Brown Plaza Courtsville, which used to be a Turkish neighborhood. Today it's one of the most trendy and hip neighborhoods in Berlin, but still very strong Turkish population. It's August and it's raining. My Polish genes are very happy. Around me, there are Palestinians, Iranians, Turks, Germans, most of whom are scholars and activists. They are working intensely on their laptops, part and alone or in groups. I waved to Abe, from whom I met 2 weeks ago in a film screening of a mutual friend, where we drum together under their buka before exchanging phone numbers. This is Berlin today for her. So perhaps we might try to, put in some insight to the questions. The indication of successful reconciliation, partly successful for these people that were there, is an indication of other reconciliations that are going on. And here I'm talking about what we all know is happening in Israel with the basically going on conflict with Palestinians, with Arab countries around, which is Israel's, besides the Holocaust, Israel's one of the biggest dramas. So, yeah, that's it.
Well, maybe since I was one of the work ministers here, I could ask a couple of questions to the panel. And one question I have, if you've been in any bookstore other than the Strand in New York, and you go to the German history section, I think you probably well experienced this. You may find a biography of Frederick the Great. You may find a biography of Bismarck. You probably won't find one of Gans, I'm sorry to say. But what you do find is rows and rows of books about the Holocaust, about Hitler. And so one of the questions I have, I guess mainly for Hadas and for Carsten, is whether we're talking about Israelis living in Berlin or whether we're talking about Germans. Is there any interest in also recovering the history of what I think most everyone who knows Jewish history would agree was a pretty remarkable German Jewish culture that existed up until the 1930s. So I'm interested in that. And if I may just ask one more question, and you all go to the audience. I'm also interested, really quite a distinct question. Is there anything going on in Germany that is akin to the politicizing of the teaching of history, even at K through 12 levels, like we have today in America, in Oklahoma, in Norman, and is this I think to me the 1619 project only let loose a kind of attention that was there for quite a while. And I'm curious to know, I guess this is to all of you, is there something to be gleaned from your experiences in Berlin about what's going on in our backyard? So those are my 2 questions.
And these are great questions. I could talk for hours, but that's not, of course, possible. I think there is interest definitely in pre-National Socialist Germany and Jewish life in Germany. I'm not quite sure, and I'm also not the expert in that regard, how much is, for example, taught about Jewish history in school. I mean, that's our target group. I mean, the younger generation, how much do they know about that? But I'm not the expert who can speak about that. I think there is an interest. There are many books about the great guys in German Jewish history predating the Holocaust, and others, but there are always, exceptional people. There's a lot of scholarship, and people read the books. I mean, there's a lot of people who are reading it. So maybe I'm coming myself, or I always want to avoid it from this elite perspective, because I know things, others do not. So that's maybe not the appropriate answer. But the other question we have right now in Germany, that's a global thing, is how to relate Jewish history, the history of the Holocaust, with everything that's related to colonialism. It's the same debate we have in America, we also have in Germany. And also how to address all groups in society, speaking about diversity. It's a big thing, we call it gender and language. We are changing we are addressing female and male, and it's really a big thing because it's kind of complex in the German language. So I'm a little bit afraid, but I mean, that where is the role then of commemorating Jewish history in particular? I'm a little bit afraid that this is maybe going up into oblivion, because everything is remembered and memorialized. So where is that the Jewish angle? Is it still there? Is it relevant? And yes, we should compare, we should bring other stuff into being, but is it then lost at some point? We can't change it, we are there forever. But that concerns me. So going back to your question, people must read more about things that predated the Holocaust, because the Holocaust is just, as Hadas said, on both sides, quote unquote. I mean, unbelievable to swallow to understand how to just way, it's just
Alan, so thank you for this question. As an Israeli, in Israel, Jewish life is studied. In Germany, in Berlin, the Israelis that I met were not going beyond the 1920s. There was a lot of Berlin was a hub for a lot of Eastern European Jewish, today they might be labeled as hipsters, that would come and write poetry or write a lot, and there's a lot to translate from that and to draw on. So that was what mostly they were focused on. Regarding what lessons could be drawn to spoke about what's happening here. I think the similarities are interesting because it's not like these atrocities happened yesterday or the previous generation or previous. No, we're talking about descendants that have to deal with this unrecognized trauma and this concern about talking about it, about exposing it. It's almost intensify it because what is unnamed, as Freud said, things have a tendency that even the repressed always appears in other ways, in other manners. So it is indeed a very big challenge just because of this shying away or even very, very violently refusing to deal with this. Yeah, I'd be happy to hear more about your thoughts about it, how to deal with this kind of a lack of emotional ability to discuss what happened in a way, so much so that there's a need to not allow discussion of can get passionate.
Just one quick thing, Alan, before you answer the question. I'm the sort of junior historian of all of this on the panel because I'm not a Europeanist or an expert on the Holocaust. I can only really share sort of from a vantage point of more sort of reflection. But in experiencing Berlin for the first time, as I said when I presented, I had never been to Berlin. It was such a powerful experience because for someone who's going there to understand and to really have try to understand the felt history of the Holocaust through public memorials, it's impossible to travel through Berlin without learning about the Holocaust in some way, right? It's everywhere, I think, and it's purposeful. I remember very clearly one evening just walking and I stumbled upon one of these stumbling stones and I stopped because that's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to stop and bear witness and learn who lived here and what they did. And so even when you're not trying to, you stumble into this history. And that's not the case with the history of German colonialism. It's absent from the public memory landscape. You only see it in traces. I was shocked when I came across it. I was traveling with our group, and we were traveling to Humboldt University, and I went inside one of the academic buildings, and inside they had a memorial to one of my heroes, Black Studies heroes, W.E.B. Du Bois, right there in the history department. And I just couldn't believe it. But the legacy of Du Bois is nowhere else, right? You see none of Du Bois's deepest teachings reflected anywhere. But he's honored at Humboldt, and he's considered a respected sociologist amongst German sociologists. So he has a presence, but it doesn't bear out. And when you talk to Zabet Schminton's students, mostly from immigrant backgrounds, Turkish, Arabic, Nigerian, they will also tell you that they're invisible in Germany, as you mentioned, Karsten. Being an immigrant is taboo to a certain degree, and it's felt by the youngest generation. And so there's so much attention and focus on the Holocaust to an extent that it almost makes invisible all other traumas, pains, peoples, or at least that's what I sensed from the disillusionment and late alienation that I felt from some of the students. And so again, I'm the novice here, but there's this deep dissonance in terms of attention and care and concern for the plight, and then in another complete disregard and invisibility and how that's felt on this current generation. I think that's playing a big role in German politics now.
I think we should open it up for questions from the audience or comments from the audience. Let me just ask everybody, for the purposes of hearing everyone's question, speak up and make it a question rather than a monologue. But please.
I was just so fascinated by what you were just saying, Carlos, and I wondered if you could tell us any more about what Zabet, as clearly a wonderful teacher,
does to kind of mediate between those two experiences, between studying the Holocaust with a group of students who feel, as you said, that their own traumas are invisible. So what does she, I mean, I don't know that you know the answer to this question. How does she do that?
I do.
I'll give it a run.
Sorry, I can run 2 hours. I can tell you what she does, because she told me what she does. I talk to her every week, almost every other day. She cares about them. She centers their pains and their traumas, and over time, she got them to care about, not just the Holocaust, but the community that was prior to them, right? That was how she got them to care. It wasn't the Holocaust, it was the neighborhood that the school resides in the previous generations that had been there, learning about them, learning to care about what had came before. But I think she only got them to do that by caring about them, a German, ethnic German woman, caring about these mostly Turkish students, feeling disillusioned, not necessarily impoverished, but disillusioned from sort of the larger society. She was someone who cared, and that was the thing that allowed them to then be vulnerable enough. Because many of them, particularly, I have some photos that I didn't share. A student that really impacted me, it's about 20, 21 years old. His name is Yunus, and he is Palestinian. And when he came to Thomas S. Community School, where Zabet teaches, he harbored a lot of anti-Semitic ideas and beliefs, but through taking field trips, through doing commemoration with him on Track 69, he's a completely different human being. And I sat with this young man, and he talked about all the different ways in which he wanted to do more. And so that's how profound caring about our students has translated into them doing this really high level remembrance work.
Let's get questions from the chat room as well.
They should be able to speak, and we should be able to hear
Okay.
them. Carsten, you're talking about the negative impact in Germany with immigrants coming into the country. When Angela Merkel brought in close to 1 million Syrians into to Germany, that had a profound effect there. And how did the normal German people deal with that situation when all this influx of people that they really did not want in their country when they came in?
Question. I think they have been, just by the numbers what we see, what we see pretty well integrated and absorbed. I do not know any statistics that tell us, well, it's just terrible, they're all unemployed, they're doing things, they are doing well, they're integrated, they're doing jobs and going to school. And so apparently the country was able to make that happen. And now, because the shift is not completely gone because of the war in Ukraine, this is really not a topic. So we don't see. But that's of course something that goes to anti-Semitism. This is usually the thing that the general story is like that. Okay, they all came from countries heavily anti-Semitic by instruction. They all now instill anti-Semitic beliefs when they come to the Netherlands. And there are sometimes incidents that speak to them. It's true. But still, statistically, the most violent anti-Semitic events that happened, the other incident when the guy was trying to blow up the synagogue on Yom Kippur, is their right-wing ethnic Germans. That's a fact. So and that's something also we need to address. And therefore, I also make this little point on all these things that are going on. Jews, Muslims getting together in North Köln, in one of the fancy neighborhoods. I try to convey a little bit the image that most people have is obscure understanding of what Jews actually are, you know, and there's a younger generation that is not relating any longer only to the history of the Holocaust. They want to be themselves, they try to define themselves as an identity. So I think the migrants that came in have been pretty well integrated. I might be wrong. I mean, there should be experts from Germany giving a better perspective. Martin, do you have any ideas to that?
But thank you all very much. I think I think most of the impressions you gave regarding the newfound, call it newfound Jewish experience, especially centered in Berlin since, I might say, for the last 20, 25 years. It's rather ambiguous in Germany. There's all these new developments, or most of these new developments. For example, as you heard, also the influx of a large quantity of Israeli expatriates to Berlin and so on. It's Berlin centered. Yeah, you shouldn't think that the rest of Germany works the same way as Berlin does now. Mm-hmm. And regarding the influx of or the rise of anti-Semitism, which also happened in Germany, at least in the last 20 years. For one thing, this is what we can see in most Western, especially Western European countries, or also Eastern European countries. But if you remember France, France has seen a stark rise of anti-Semitism in the last 20 years. So that's not to say that it's a development which just happens because it happens. It happens because there are converging a lot of different forms of anti-Semitic thinking. There's the old anti-Semitism, there's the new anti-Semitism, and the new anti-Semitism also is fired up from different sources, from different backgrounds. Yeah, there's so one could say there's the imported anti-Semitism, which is connected to the migration to some kind of immigration. Yeah, but also there's the homemade or the homebrew anti-Semitism, which was never gone in Germany.
Right. Yes. Yeah. I mean, that's a good point. It was actually never gone. So, I mean, I'm a little bit the pessimist, you know, and so I agree what you wanted to say. I try to be optimistic, but what is more starring to me that many people I meet, and just the older generation mainly, they don't want to listen and they don't understand, you know. There's still this, it doesn't go. There's still the belief that Jews have to do something, you know. They have to understand that they are just a religious group, okay, and then anti-Semitism will be gone. So I hear many people of the older generation, older than you are, than we are, who think, well, you know, it's awful that it happens, but it must have something to do with it. I mean, they're really struggling with anti-Semitism, but they think the Jews have to do something. You know what I mean? They have to define themselves religiously only, and then it will be gone. So you have all these well-intended people. I meet them all the time when I tell them I'm doing Jewish history, and as a non-Jew, this is also a curiosity. And it's always this, and sometimes I avoid talking about it because it's so stressful. Because they all have these ideas or these books or these ideas, and I tell them, you know what, these are discussions we had them 200 years ago. Where is it going now? It's very tough And so sometimes I just try to say, well, I'm doing German history or no, history of Westphalia or something. It's easier. No, really. I mean, I shouldn't do it, but it's really not easy. And I shouldn't complain. But thanks, Martin.
Can I add something to answer the question regarding the inference? So basically, I think that many of those immigrants came after 2015, or when I was there. And what my colleague was saying, that Berlin is an island, so true, because in Berlin there seemed to be almost be a competition who could volunteer more, and immigrant shelters, and it was the hip thing to do, and also the Israelis, non-Israelis, if I call them, that I following and involved with their lives, they also seem to be connecting, and I think that raised in many ways their awareness that, oh wow, we are all from the Middle East. And I remember one day I went to this panel about African refugees in Israel. That was basically, there were 3 Israeli women that volunteered and worked in refugee centers in Israel. And there were some guys asking their many questions that were very knowledgeable. And at the end, turned out they were just Syrian refugees, and they knew so much what was happening in Israel. And they were part of this, what I was saying, a political community that was kind of created around the shared identity of leaving our country and coming to a new country. So I think it's really just how it affected Germany outside of Berlin, how it affected Berlin, and how it affected those Israelis that were.
Riley, maybe you better just speak up.
Sure, I can talk loud. Yes, I have 2 questions. One is easier to formulate because it wasn't mentioned and it's sort of random, which is just that there was a story that I was reading, or that on the way home from work, Mark was reading it to me about a cantor in Germany, who is upset that Germans have converted to Judaism because, and Mark was reading the story to me as I was driving home. I just Googled it. I think her name is Avital someone, I don't know his name, and that she was upset that so many Germans are converting to Judaism because, and she's making an argument that like the synagogue doesn't feel Jewish anymore, and the people who are converting because they want to identify more with Jews than the families who are the persecutors. So it wasn't mentioned, and it's random, but I'm just curious about that. The second question is harder to articulate, and I'm really fascinated both by everyone's comments, but just thinking about Carsten's comments and Karlos' comments. Seems, Carsten, you're sort of, I know nothing about present day Germany, and I need to travel to Germany, but just it's interesting to hear how your perception is, which it must be a bit correct that we do, is that a lot of Germans don't know about Jews, don't know enough about this history, right? About how that seems to be the case. And then Karlos sort of saying, that when he went on this trip, minorities were feeling like they could better understand the trauma of the Holocaust if their own trauma was recognized. And so I'm thinking about I'm thinking about the uniqueness of the Holocaust and how important it is to emphasize that. And I think Carsten said that at one point. And then I'm thinking about the situation of Jews in the United States. And even Karlos and I did a panel before COVID, a long time ago, on Black-Jewish relations. But this sort of feeling among American Jews, at least in like the multicultural, when that paradigm came together in the 70s and the 80s, Jews were sort of left out because Jews were seen as kind of privileged and white. And so their trauma, their victimization was no longer taken seriously, and they're not as important as those of people of color, or those Jews of color. So it's like, it's almost, I don't know if there's a question here, but just thinking of, so in Germany, it seems from Carsten's remarks, there needs to be sort of an emphasis on the uniqueness of the Holocaust. And then it's interesting to think about it in the United States that, if anything, I think there was a feeling that, Jews were sort of dismissed as just white, so their history doesn't have that much to tell us. And so here, maybe this is me sounding like, I don't want to sound like a cynic, but I think the question is, I completely buy and think that knowing about other people's trauma and having understanding is what's going to get us to a better place. But how can we do that without avoiding like competition between trauma and victimization? Is there a question? Did that come out as a question? So.
It's a question.
Okay.
It's a question. Would you like me to start? You really did. I don't know if I have a good answer. What moved, I can only really speak about what I witnessed and what I experienced in relationship to some of the remembrance work. And so I just think that there's such an investment in remembering and trying to elevate this history that it may have created a level of fatigue for recognizing and trying to grapple with the much more extensive history of white supremacy in Germany that's connected with colonialism. And so I think there's, and so it's for me who, I was there to just really focus on sites, memorial sites. So it was very present to me. And I think to a certain degree, it would be baffling to me to sort of think about how Germans would not know something about the Holocaust or how to do it socially because it's against the law. It's just against the law not to deny the Holocaust, which I thought was something that would never happen in America. But in Germany, it is, it's just, it's sacrosanct that you can't, that we did that, and we have to be accountable for that. I found that to be powerful, so that even if there is no sort of in-depth knowledge of the Holocaust in the populace, there is this commitment, at least, to recognizing it, that's something that, again, in this country, in a long time. So that to me is something significant. I don't know how that exactly answers your question, Ronnie, but we'll work it out later. We'll work it out.
I think there was a recent poll asking how the Germans think about the past. That's almost 50% now say, well, therefore, I'm concerned, because it's I'm correct. I can say that 20 years ago, I was not able to say that, so I'm growing also in my own position. I said it would answer no. I think what Hadas said is very important. Acknowledging this trauma, and I still think that many Germans are not quite aware of the fact that they all have been somehow involved. It's something that usually you always heard these stories when I was younger. Yeah, my grandfather was a resistance. I didn't believe that when I was a child. So there are all resistance fighters around me. And so, and still when I read it today, it's always coming on. Always, even when the grandpa was hiding something. Or just a pamphlet. I mean, I never believe it. I mean, so that's the thing. What is trauma? Where does it begin? And every day we have to ask ourselves what's going on when you see what is something on the street. I mean, that's the thing. That's the reality. So uniqueness, yes, because it makes me believe I can be a better person when I always think about it. But most people don't. And I mean, not because I'm better. I deal with that every day. So answer conversos, but not conversos in Spanish. Converts is a big story in Germany. We talk about an hour, but I'm not in Germany, so I can only say very few words because it's recorded. It's very dangerous terrain. They are converts and they are not highly regarded. That's trading in Jewish history, depending where you look at. And so there are always these kind of rumors that the converts are taking over the communities in Germany and stuff like that. And many of the converts did it, I mean, psychologically, because they want to deal with the trauma somehow. They think when they're Jewish, then you can deal with it. But the woman you are quoting is basically saying, well, and now they try to teach us, the real Jews, I mean, what we should do as Jews. So there's really some conflict going on. And there are converts. I mean, when I grew up, there were always people who converted or made the stories that they were as a child in Auschwitz and stuff like that. And there was a whole huge following. And I think it's also this kind of coping which, was never said, never articulated. Yeah, that's my comment.
So when you were saying about the basement, I thought, wow, when I moved to Berlin, my postdoc, my first 2 months, I stayed at one of my best friends' mom, New York, German, at her mom's place. In West Berlin, beautiful. I had a basement where they converted it, they put all of my friend's stuff. It was really, they made it lovely. And one day I saw an old photos album, and I thought, oh, now I can see my friend as a child. So I open it, and then I see a man with uniform and a swastika. And then I realized, wow, that was a grandfather who was a soldier, who was a doctor in the army. And afterwards, when I spoke with one of my interviewees, she said Berlin, Germany is filled with these kind of basements. And I think that it's a really interesting question. When does drama start? How do you deal with it? Because I'm sure that from her point of view, that kind of exists and doesn't exist. There's an acknowledgement of it, but it is. I mean, maybe if she knew that the book was there, she would have said something. Or that photo, I'm sorry, or her mom would have said something. So it's this. I think that raises the question: how do you deal with this kind of a past when it's in your family's how does that affect everything? And there was one German friend who told me, yeah, everyone has a resistance member in their family. Everyone is saying account for everyone, everyone is me. And then what I saw was basically the opposite. So, and I never spoke to her about it. I thought, what would I say? What would
No, I just want to share one more example that I didn't get to in the presentation. I talked a lot about the Thomas Hess Community School that and the teachers at Schmitzhall, who's done tremendous work around the track 69 with their students, with their working group. One of the really profound experiences I had was meeting a second generation of survivors. Shoshana Bennett, she was born far involved in an deportation camp, one of the largest in Germany after the war. She was born there. Her father was the only survivor from her family saved unharmed. And the story that she tells about growing up in Farmville is so powerful. She currently lives in outside of Jerusalem, and she comes to Germany to Munich all the time to participate in the Bauhaus project that tells the story of the deportation camp that she was born in. And so her story is so profound to me because it's a story of reconciliation and forgiveness. I asked her, because I was able to interview her after I was there, how did she find the strength to confront this history, right, on the Holocaust? Her family, unspeakable violence committed against her family. How could she find the strength to do that? And not only do that for herself, but she's convinced numerous others who were born there, or who at one point in time lived in that camp to come back, right, and reconcile themselves to it. So her story is truly profound. And in 2022, the Bauhaus Project that tells that story just recently won an Overmeyer Award. And so I had a picture of her because I was able to have dinner with her a couple of nights and really try to understand how do you face unspeakable violence and have resilience in the face of it. And she has some amazing things to say. And so those are one of the things that I hope I'm bringing back. I want to share and in my classes and in the work. Is her story of resilience and strength, but anyway, that's my final comment.
Well, I have a sense this evening, a very strong sense that we really started a conversation rather than summarized and concluded one. So I'm very glad about that. And I want to thank, I think I'm only the people up here can see all the people on Zoom, but we thank you for zooming in. And everybody here in the room, thank you as well. And Trice has arranged refreshments. If they're in no rush, they're over there, and we've ordered them. We'll be ashamed to let it go to waste. I always feel that way about food. And I want to just really, I think let's all give a big hand to Hadas